Good morning, folks, and welcome to a Tropical Cyclone Kirrily forecast update. Today is 7th of the 3rd, 2025, looking at the on-the-ground effects of the upcoming tropical cyclone strike. Now, for the first time in about 3.5 days, I've been able to use the word tropical cyclone without feeling like a part of my scientific brain just died. So, the good news there is that the cyclone is tightening up and it is showing a tropical structure. The bad news, it's always good news, bad news. So the good news from that perspective is that its effects will start to become a little bit more concentrated into the center. Its wind effects will be anyway. Its rain effects will be still felt well away from the center, but its wind effects will be felt a little closer to the center. The bad news, of course, is that center is going basically right over the top of Brisbane City. So this increases the risk of Brisbane maybe witnessing Category 1 impacts. We are still going to see Category 2 impacts, just like we were expecting last night. 110s, 120s, maybe 130s on that section of coastline, particularly from about Surfers Paradise through to Stradbroke Island. This area here is going to be the primary focus of the biggest winds of the system based on current modelling. These are the places we expect to see our 120s and 130s as the cyclone approaches the coastline overnight tonight and early tomorrow morning. Right, the cyclone is a Category 2 and it is tracking in a general westerly direction, expected to shift in a bit more of a northwesterly track. You can see the error margin now really tightening up to southern Stradbroke Island, or southern parts of Stradbroke Island, all the way up, and there's still a northern extension that takes us all the way up to Gympie and north of the Sunshine Coast. So that's still a bit of a problem area, that potential northerly shift, because there are some models that suggest a slightly further northward shift. But we can safely rule out now a coastal crossing around the Coolangatta area. The cyclone shouldn't move much further southwest from where it is now. It's either going to move west or northwest from this point. We zoom into the area of impact and we can see here right around Brisbane City, the cyclone crossing the coast in the northern edge of Brisbane and between Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast as a Category 2 tropical cyclone over the top of Moreton Island and Stradbroke Islands, and then as a Category 1 system as it hits the coastline. The cyclone will likely be creating those Category 2 winds over the top of Stradbroke Island and just to the north of Surfers Paradise. This area does appear to be the focal point of attention of bigger winds as the cyclone's core comes towards the coast. So once again, the good news is that destructive wind field is going to shrink as the cyclone structure improves, and that means that these Category 2 wind effects won't be felt as widespread as they were feared to be felt. It hasn't changed the maximum wind profiles. They're still around that 120, 130 range, but it will decrease the area of effect and it will look and feel a bit more like a tropical cyclone, where things aren't happening until they all happen all of a sudden. So far, we've seen winds up to 100 kilometres an hour at Coolangatta, and we've seen winds about that also through northeastern parts of New South Wales. The cyclone may be packing winds up to about 150 kilometres an hour in the eye wall, but that eye wall, as it gets onto the coast, is going to start to degrade, and as it degrades, those 150 pluses probably aren't going to be felt on the mainland. If they are, they're going to be felt right on the edge of Stradbroke Island here. So nothing has changed in terms of our maximum wind expectations. So that 110, 120, sure, maybe 130, yeah. But we're not going to see the 160s, 170s that were feared if the cyclone would turn into Category 3, etc. So expect it, though, to start to tighten up today, and I like that structure. It does certainly look to me more like a tropical system, and we'll talk more about that in the technical forecast later on today. Right, with that being said, I want us to focus on ground zero, which is going to be Brisbane, Surfers Paradise, Stradbroke Island, maybe up to Caloundra. I want to focus really hard on this district here. Then we'll talk about the rest of you down here around Coolangatta down towards northeast New South Wales, and then we'll talk about the rest of you up here from Maroochydore northwards. And finally, we'll finish off talking about Toowoomba, Warwick and those areas inland down towards the area west of Lismore. Alright, so the difference between a tropical cyclone and what this thing was yesterday in the last few days is that the wind field tightens up. And what happens is we go from just another windy, rainy day and suddenly we get into this bang, this little eye wall edge. Now, sure, it's not going to be like the big ones that we've been through where we suddenly get into just craziness, but it's going to feel way more intense getting close to the centre than it would have felt, say, if the cyclone maintained yesterday's structure. So, with that being said, let's focus on this area from about Surface Paradise, and let's focus on the area further northwards, and especially looking at this Stradbroke Island region. Between Surface and Stratty is where I'm anticipating that potential for mainland, the biggest winds on the mainland. So we're looking here at wind gusts. Now, this is the absolute worst case scenario, and because the model does tend to be a little bit hyperactive in terms of its wind gusts, especially when it comes to tropical cyclones. But I need us to understand what the absolute worst scenario is, so then we're a little bit more chilled when the absolute worst scenario doesn't quite occur. But absolute worst scenario, we're still looking at 50 knot gusts coming on to Moreton Island. So you can see Moreton Island getting that big, strong southwesterly. You can see here off the coastline there's big, strong southwesterlies, and all the cool sort of colours, they're way off the coastline at the moment this morning. Now, as we go through the afternoon, what changes? Lunchtime today, still the big purpley colours, the scary colours are offshore. So that means we're getting wind gusts getting up to about 50, 55 knots on that section of coastline. So gale force gusts, maybe getting into damaging gusts. You can see around Moreton Island, things are settled down a little bit, temporarily settled down. You can see around Brisbane, just another windy day. Don't worry about it, just another windy day. For now, don't worry about it. Just another windy day. All right, now, as we go through the afternoon, what we're going to find is, generally speaking, Moreton Island is going to go through these periods of gale force gusts and potentially sort of not storm force, let's just say damaging wind gusts, potentially occasionally occurring. North Stratty also, you can see that southwesterly really kicking up steam the moment it gets offshore. You can see that southwesterly almost parallel to the coastline of North Stratty and South Stratty, but you can see all of our big scary colours are still offshore this afternoon. As we go into this evening and tonight, we start to see our big scary colours. You can see here squalls. This will be our first big wind coming through. Brisbane, you can start to see we're just getting up to that 35 knot range with our wind gusts at this stage by about this evening. But what I'm looking for here are the big scary colours down here. I want to see how they operate on the coastline. You can see at the moment they're off the coastline. Now, as we get into 7 p.m. and 8 p.m, there's a chance that one or two of those scary colours starts to get on the coastline. So you can see there's opportunities for around 60 to 65 knots of wind coming in just one sort of gust, not a sustained wind, just a gusty wind comes through at about 120 kilometres an hour, 115 to 120. So that's our first sign that things are going, ooh, this is a little step up. Once again, Brisbane, what do we got? 40 knot gusts, so about 65, 70 kilometre an hour gusts, right? So nothing too dramatic there for Brisbane at around 70 kilometres an hour, but certainly feels more than just a windy day now as we get into the evening hours. The big purpley colours, still for the most part, are staying offshore. We do start to get gusts that are getting up in that 50 to 60 knot range around Moreton Island, the western parts of Moreton Island. Now, here's where the purpley bits start to get onto the coast. So 9 p.m, 10 p.m, 11 p.m. You can see that our big purpley bits are just getting onto the exposed coast. These are our wind gusts of about 60 to 70 knots. So these are wind gusts at about 110 to 130 kilometres an hour as we go through the nighttime hours. Remember, we're looking here at worst case scenarios, then we're going to look at expected case scenarios. If we're ready for the worst, we can't be surprised when things don't get as bad. We don't want to look for the expected case scenario and then have people going, oh, I didn't expect that. All right, so there's our worst case scenario. 120s, 130s are possible overnight tonight in this section of coastline. This is the section of coastline, once again, I'm most concerned about. Surface Paradise through to the northern tip of Stratty. That part there is certainly the part that I'd be most focused on. Now, we've got a bit of timing problems when it comes to the cyclone hitting the coast because it may come onto the coast a little earlier than the model suggests. It may wobble onto the coast overnight early in the morning. But I want you to pay attention to the tight wind field. This is not something the cyclone's been doing so far in the last 3 days. Last 3 days, it's been blowing wind everywhere and anywhere. This period here, where it becomes tropical, we really start to have to focus on the eye wall feature. Now, I say eye wall, we're talking more, it might not have a proper eye, but it will have a centre of circulation. It will be trying to pack these winds tightly around the centre. Now, once again, what's Brisbane going on with here? Southerlies, southwesterlies, 35 knots, right? Overnight tonight, early tomorrow, gusting to 35 knots. But it's this area here that gets the purpley stuff. 60 to 70 knots on this section of Straddie. As we continue on, we can see that those winds are probably going to peak in the morning tomorrow as the cyclone gets onto the coast. Now, once again, we have a timing issue, right? The timing issue, that's a problem. We can see they're peaking at about 70 knots on Straddie. On the mainland, they're not peaking that much, but on Straddie, they're peaking at 70 knots. That's about 130 k an hour on the actual island. On the mainland, we're getting peaks at about 110, 115 kilometres an hour is the general peak at this point in time. Now, the cyclone's core, the core winds start to impact us, and this is the part where things get really hairy. Right at this period where the edge of the eye is getting very close to Moreton Bay or Moreton Island and Stradbroke Island, our core winds are now impacting the coast. See this? Our core winds have the potential to be up around 70 to 75 knots at the top end of the scale. So at the top end of the scale, we're looking at 70 to 75 knots, and that's about 130 to 140 kilometre an hour winds on that exposed coastline, not inland 5 kilometres, no, exposed coastline, exposed island areas, right? They're the areas that are going to pick up those big core winds. As we continue on, we see the edge of the eye nudging the coast, and we start to see a degradation of the wind field at that point. And the degradation of the wind field is gradual. It doesn't just bang happen, but the gradual decrease in wind process occurs because of the actual impact of the ground on the circulation. The ground slows down the air flowing into the cyclone, and in turn will start to weaken the dynamics of the cyclone. But that process takes time. Now, in the meantime, I've been gibbering about surface paradise and all these areas up down here. What's Brisbane getting? At this point, Brisbane's starting to get quite blowy. Brisbane's starting to get those wind gusts getting up to about 100 kilometres an hour here. And then as the cyclone comes onto the coast, you can see the eyes coming onto the coast. Well, it's basically a little bit late on this model, but it's coming onto the coast, and we've got another little burst of air here, or another little burst of wind here, once again around that 75 knot range. So around that 130, 140 kilometre an hour mark on the south side of the system. Now, not quite down around surface. Surface is getting 60 to 65. But this area right around South Straddie, they're getting smacked. And you can see then, as we get into Brisbane, we're getting 45 to 50s. All right, so the max there that we're expecting around Brisbane is around that 100 kilometre an hour range. All right, well, then that's not a joke wind, but it's not that 155 kilometres an hour that the cyclone's probably going to be packing just offshore, or that 130 or possibly even 140 that we could see on an isolated pocket of coastline here on the exposed coast. But it isn't a joke wind. It's also a dangerous wind at 100 k an hour. All right, as we continue on, the eye of the cyclone comes onto the coast right over the top of Brisbane, or just to the north of Brisbane at the moment, according to the Bureau. And the expectation is that the flow will turn, the winds will turn. You'll see there a bit of a northeasterly that will develop, right? So northeasterly develops through the afternoon. Now, this wind won't be quite as strong, but it'll be coming directly off the ocean. So we may see a little bit more penetration of that wind a little bit further inland because it's coming directly off the ocean. You can see an easterly flow around surface. Once again, big winds, 50 to 60 knots, so possibly 100, 120s on the way back after the cyclone crosses the coastline. You can see lower wind regimes around Brisbane and the northern suburbs of Brisbane because that's where our cyclone is now, the centre of circulation is. And then on Moreton Island, already we're starting to see northeasterlies kicking up at 50 knots, gusting to 50 knots. As we continue on, we can see that the continuation of the cyclone to the west very slowly is going to allow this northeasterly wind flow to come into Brisbane City. And you can see the northeasterlies getting up to 30 to 40 knots here in Brisbane City. And then we can see around Straddie, we've just been copping 120, 130s from the southeast. Now we're getting them from the northeast at about 100. All right, so That's Stratty, and then further south around surface, we've just copped about 120, 130s from the southeast or south-southeast. Now we're copping them from the east. And these ones are coming head on. They're not being sort of sheltered a little bit by the orientation of the coastline or by land masses. These are coming head on into the region. Right, the cyclone then continues to shift westwards, and we maintain or even increase our northeasterly flow towards the back end of Saturday. And this becomes a real problem when it comes to rainfall. Talk about rainfall in a sec. But this will become a real problem when it comes to rainfall. This northerly, northeasterly converging flow right on this section of coastline between Brizzy and the Gold Coast. This becomes a main focus area for rainfall as and after the cyclone has crossed the coast. Right, so that was an example of the wind field if the cyclone can start to really put itself together and create that little bit of an eye wall. This is the difference of what would happen if the cyclone probably doesn't do that in time. What we're going to see here, and this is a great example of probably a low to mid-range scenario, right? So what we just looked at there was the high-range scenario of wind and intensities. This is the mid-range or low-range scenarios. You can see there we're still getting 130s, 130-somethings around the southwestern eye wall, but we're only getting about 110 to 115s on the coastline. On the Gold Coast, we're getting winds around that 90 to 100 range. In Brisbane, we're getting winds at about 50 to 60. This is by tonight. As we go into early tomorrow, you can start to see winds at 110 to 120s on the Stradbroke Island, South Stradbroke Island, Southern North Stradbroke Island area. Generally, winds around that 100 to 110s on the coastline. These are maximum gusts, by the way, folks. These aren't sustained winds. Sustained winds are way less than that. All right, but understand that these are sort of our maximum gusty wind ranges. For Brisbane, it just gets a little bit gustier at 60 to 70 between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., the cyclone degrades very quickly. So this is the thing, right? If it's got a really nice core, that core is going to take an extra few hours to degrade. And what we saw in the first instance was the degradation of the core a little bit slower. In this instance, we see the degradation of the core almost immediately on approach to Moreton Island. So you can see here, tonight, strong core, 11 p.m. tonight, strongest core, 2 a.m. in the morning, strong core. As we go into 5 a.m. in the morning, the core just completely degrades, almost instantaneously within touching that area of the coastline. The core instantaneously degrades. I think that's a little bit too aggressive degradation of the core. I think there's still going to be a little bit more oomph in it than what the model there is suggesting. But it is our number one model in the world, and it is something we have to take into account. But the core degradation that quickly would mean that the cyclone would have to be extremely weak cored as it gets to the coast. If it's packing any deep convection around the core, this degradation won't be as sharp. Right, so let's have a look at ground zero, and I want us to compare high range versus low range scenarios. Firstly, for Stratty and for the Gold Coast and for Brisbane City. High range wind scenarios. We're looking at maximum winds around Brisbane City of 47 knots at the high range scenario. We're looking at the Gold Coast at about 69 knots at the high range scenario. We're looking at Tweed at about 67 knots. Kingscliff, 68 knots. We're looking at Stradbroke Island here, right on that coastline, on that eastern and southern coastline especially. This is the area that I'd be most concerned about from a wind perspective, is this area just north of the Gold Coast and onto the southern Stratty region. And you can see our maximum winds at the top end scenario are around that 75, 76 knot range. So the 75, 76 knots is about 140 kilometers an hour maximum winds at the top range scenario, right? That's the absolute maximum we'd be expecting on that coastline, 140 k's an hour. Now, it's also important to understand there may be a little bit of a wind gradient through parts of Brisbane, where some of the southern suburbs of Brisbane may see winds more around that 50 to 60 knot range versus Brisbane CBD, which would likely see winds peaking at about 50 knots max. And then obviously the further north we go, the less likely we are to see huge intensities in those winds. So that's our ground zero maximum case scenarios. This is a ground zero in our lowercase, probably two lowercase scenario, where we see Tweed Head maxing out at about 50 knot gusts, Gold Coast at about 53 knots, Pimpama at 51 knots, some of the southern suburbs of Brisbane in the 45 to 50 range, Brisbane itself around 45 knots, and then that Stratty area that I'm particularly a little bit concerned about, only maxing out at a maximum, I say it with the greatest respect, but only maxing out at about 50 to 55 knots, and none of that is overly destructive except for bringing down a few trees. Obviously the difference there is quite significant, where we could see those 55 knots turn into 65 to 70 knots on that section of coastline, and that does become into the destructive range, where we're destroying things, not just trees, but we're potentially creating a little bit of structural damage in these sorts of wind environments here. Rather, those wind intensities here. So this is my primary concern area when it comes to wind damage, is going to be this Gold Coast, i.e. Surface Paradise area, northwards through to South Stradbroke Island, and then through to the eastern edge of North Stradbroke Island. They are my primary concern areas for wind damage. And we're expecting, at the top scale of the scenarios, winds around that 130 to 140 range. Right, forecast radar. Let's have a look here for this region. We can see that we've got generally quite a few showers coming in from the southeasterly flow on the outskirts of the cyclone circulation. Now, the cyclone does attempt to put a core together, very, very importantly, as we go into the afternoon. So you can see here it's trying to put a core together. It's obviously very strong on the southern core, and it's creating significant rainfall offshore. Some of that is coming onto the southeast Queensland coast, particularly around the Gold Coast. We're not expecting to see a hell of a lot of rain around Brisbane in the through the day today, but as we get into tonight, we're going to see showers just increasing in frequency across that area. And once again, we're looking for the core here to see whether or not it's going to start to put together a pretty decent core. And if it does, we're going to start to see heavier falls of rain as that happens. And you can see here that the cyclone, as it's putting together a core and the core starts to come onto the coast, we're going to see heavy falls of rain. Once again, Gold Coast, southern Brisbane into the Stradbroke and potentially Moreton Islands. Now, further to the north, we're not going to see any significant rainfall aspects of this system until after it crosses. Now, once it's crossed the coast tomorrow morning, the expectation is this northerly and northeasterly flow is going to drive very heavy rainfall. Some of the heaviest rainfall is going to, well, most of the heaviest rainfall is going to happen well after the cyclone crosses the coast. And you can see this northerly, northeasterly. This is a real potent mix of rainfall, and it's not just coastal, and that's the problem, right? This rainfall extends west through to Boona, through to Ipswich, through to the hinterland areas, and through to the escarpment regions. And so that the escarpment regions then give it another little boost up as well, because they force the air up a little bit more violently as these winds hit the escarpment. So what we're going to find when it comes to precip is we're going to find just general precip, just some shower activity precip to start with. Maybe a little bit of heavier stuff as that southwestern core tries to impact the coastline from this evening and tonight. And then as we move in and the real core starts to hit us, and that's happening tomorrow morning, after the core crosses the coast, you can see these really heavy falls of rain, 40 to 50 mils in an hour coming through, and you can see that extra lift going on the mountain ranges. And this becomes our primary concern for flooding as we continue on. And you can see falls in the 50 to 100 millimetres an hour range are possible in this setup once the cyclone has come onto the coast and developing that north to northeasterly convergence feeder band. Holy dooly, there's going to be some big rain here, folks, and we need to be ready for that rain. The primary threat, let's be very clear here, is not wind. Unless you're on that section of coast I'm concerned about, it's not wind. Yes, sure, there's going to be some trees down, absolutely. There might even be some fences down. There might be some poorly built sheds down, all right? But that's not the primary threat here. The primary threat outside of that area that I just spoke about is going to be this, after the system crosses, the massive amounts of rain that's going to occur. And I want you to pay attention there to the accumulated precipitation until tomorrow morning. So remember, tomorrow morning, the cyclone's basically very close to the coast, if not on the coast, right? And look at the rain before it hits. Not much there, especially in these other areas around Brizzy, northern suburbs of Brizzy. Sure, it's a showery day, it's a blustery day, but there's not a hell of a lot of flooding there yet Obviously, the Gold Coast, it's a bit of a different story, especially on the mountain ranges where there's been a bit of lift. So those numbers could still get up there again over the course of the next 24 hours. But I want you to pay attention to how this increases as we go through Saturday. So Saturday, 7 a.m., Saturday lunchtime, look at the increase, and then look at the massive increase as we get into Saturday night. Look at how quickly those rain totals begin to ramp up as we get to Saturday night, and they'll continue through the nighttime hours on Saturday and into Sunday. And we take a look here at the rainfall from the Euro model. Remember, this is the model that has a lower end impact where the cyclone completely degrades, even nudging the coastline, which I think is a little bit unnatural. I don't think we're going to see that faster degradation. But you can see here as we go into Friday 8 p.m, Friday 10 p.m, you can see a heavy rainfall on the Gold Coast only. Brisbane's getting showers, but nothing heavy yet. Heavy rainfall on the Gold Coast, northeast New South Wales. As we go into 1 a.m, you can see some heavier falls starting to develop around Brisbane City, but still in the moderate range. 4 a.m, you can see some heavy falls on the Gold Coast, in that little area that I'm particularly concerned about, in between the Gold Coast and Straddie. As we continue on, we can see, as we go into 7 a.m, we can see that some of those heavier falls are just starting to extend westwards. The cyclone's core degrades very quickly in this model, but that doesn't matter. See, even when the cyclone core degrades, we're still getting that beautiful northeasterly convergence maximum right between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and heavy falls of rain, 50 plus millimetres over 3 hours. As we go on and the cyclone pushes inland a little bit further by 1 p.m, look at the heavy falls of rain, 50 to 100 millimetres between Brisbane and the Gold Coast over 3 hours. So we're already up to 100 plus millimetres in 6 hours here, and then potentially more than that. And then as we go into the next 3 hour period, you can see falls up to about 100 millimetres developing over 3 hours as we push into, and these are very dangerous falls because they're starting to fall inland of the coast. We're still getting heavy rain on the coast, and that's our third period of 3 hours where we're seeing in excess of 50 millimetres. But look at the dangerous falls happening further inland now. So these are really sharp and strong rainfall totals over a short period of time happening on the hinterland. And those 100 millimetre falls on the hinterland are happening 2 lots of 3 hours in a row. So that's up to 200 millimetres in 6 hours. So we're starting to really see the intensity potential in this lies in the rain, not so much the wind. We've been very focused in the media about the wind and the whole idea of the cyclone. But in the end, this is what it's going to be remembered for, and that's the rainfall. As we go into 7 p.m. to 10 p.m, we can see that. Look at that escarpment lifting that rain, getting it right up over 100 millimetres over 3 hours on the escarpment, on those hilly countries out the back of Boona. And you can see still significant rainfall on the rest of the coastline. Just the big falls are happening where the escarpment is forcing lift. And then as we push into Saturday night, Sunday morning, look at that. Look at the incredible intensity of the rainfall through here and extending down towards Warwick by that stage. And we're finally starting to see things settling down on the coast, but the inland areas here are really getting a touch up big time as we move into Sunday morning before finally the whole system begins to let go and push away from the region. We've got a few follow-up showers and thunderstorms which are going to annoy people who are trying to get back on their feet. But there will be lots of breaks in between those to give you a chance to start to clean up after this whole mess is done. Right, until midnight Sunday night, rainfall totals in the 2 to 500 millimetres are pretty much commonplace around southeast Queensland's Gold Coast to Brisbane area. But importantly, we extend those 2 to 500s back west towards Warwick. Areas just sort of south of Toowoomba. These areas are also seeing those very heavy falls. You can see some locally heavy falls on the Sunshine Coast, up to about 100, possibly 150 mils. And then you can see into northeast New South Wales. This is another real focus area. This catchment area of Lismore still expecting, on top of what they've had already, which has been upwards of 100, possibly up to 200 mils in parts of the catchment. That entire catchment is still expecting another 150, 200 millimetres coming out. And then we're expecting to see lots of that rain streaming down through northern New South Wales. And eventually the remnants of this cyclone will push out into the Tasman. And folks, I need you to remember the one thing that's the feature of this rain, right, is that it's not over multiple days. a lot of this 3 to 500 happens in the space of, the large chunk of it will happen in the space of 12 to 18 hours. Most of it will happen in that period, in that sort of period of time. Those 12 hours might be a little bit different for Brisbane than they will be for areas inland, but it'll be that 12-hour period for each one of those locations where most of that rain will fall. And so it's the flash flood that could really pose the biggest risk, because those water levels are going to skyrocket really fast because a lot of that rain's going to fall really quickly. Right, I want to have a quick look here at northeast New South Wales. Obviously, the cyclone is becoming tropical this morning. It hasn't been tropical so far. That means what we've seen so far is a big loosey-goosey circulation that's been driving big winds all the way down into this area, right? Now, what happens here is as the cyclone begins to tighten up, it begins to contract its wind field. And so what we end up seeing is the maximum sort of winds up around the Gold Coast. We've still got a fairly large area of potential gales, though, and that does extend a long way further northwards. And so what happens, and the fundamental change here, is that the cyclone is able to produce its biggest winds closer to it. That doesn't mean for a second, though, that the cyclone can't produce some bigger winds further away as well. And so for you, it means a consistent gale force wind pattern is likely in the region, with the strongest, those destructive winds probably likely to sort of pull up to the centre of the circulation. Now, what that means further southwards, though, is what we tend to find in a cyclone is we tend to find its strongest winds around the circulation, and then we find a secondary maximum away from the circulation. In between, there's not much. It's a bit of a moat. But the secondary maximum here is an area that we focus on for potential things like water spouts and other little goodies that happen, like very strong squall lines along with the shower activity. So that's what we're looking for around that Byron Bay, Ballina area, that secondary maximum, especially tonight into early tomorrow, for that secondary maximum of wind effects in that area. They won't be as strong as the primary maximum, but they will be strong enough to be quite dangerous if you're not expecting them. The big thing you're going to find in this part of the world is going to be the rainfall. Now, you folks have already got the head start by a couple of days on rainfall. There's further good falls to come today, and you can see them very widespread. There's some breaks in between, but generally speaking, it's a very showery day, and those showers are going to start to really add up rain totals across northeast New South Wales, and you can see very significant rainfall will develop and continue to operate through this district while the cyclone is to the north-northeast. Now, as the cyclone crosses the coast, the focus will become a bit more of an easterly flow. So this rainfall will come through from an easterly direction as opposed to just a southeasterly direction. And so these ranges here on the north side of or basically on the border, so the north side of the state, we're going to find they're going to have a little bit less of an impact in the lifting process than they do now in that easterly flow, and we're going to find the Great Dividing Range has a much greater focus of lift as we get that more easterly flow. And so what we're going to find are rainfall totals through the interior here are going to really start to ramp up as we move into tomorrow. And you can see how the mountain range effects are creating those massive falls here, and then as we push further to the west, less rainfall. So when we take a look at Friday's accumulated precip, you can see there some pretty good precip forced up by the mountain ranges. And then as we go into Saturday, we can see that precip is higher, but it's more dispersed right across the region. You can see the mountain range effects this time are impacting and creating the biggest rain north of them into Queensland rather than into New South Wales. Those mountain ranges are doing a lot of lift, but this time on an east to northeasterly flow pattern, which means that the Queensland side of the border picks up the biggest rain versus today where the New South Wales side of the border picks up the biggest rain. The key pattern here, though, and the key understanding is that widespread heavy rain is expected. Friday, you can see it ramping up tomorrow right across the region. Into Sunday, it'll start shifting southwards and westwards. And then into Monday, the remnant part of that cyclone will start to push southeastwards out of here. And Tuesday, it should be exiting the coast. But we do have an upper level trough in behind, which is going to keep things very unsettled for a little period of time through here. So end result over the next few days is going to be a significant amount of rain with widespread flooding across northeastern New South Wales and even northern inland New South Wales as well. Right, we talked about, let's have a look at the Sunshine Coast region. We talked about the Brisbane area, and we talked about the fact that they're expecting to see sort of max winds gusting to about 50 knots in the Brisbane city region. What we can see here for the Sunshine Coast is fairly similar sort of maximum wind regime. So around 30 to 40 knots around Maroochydore and Caloundra would be about the maximum at this stage. But when the cyclone and after the cyclone crosses the coast, what we may see here are some squalls that can lead us to get those really, really intense winds in that squall line pattern after the cyclone has exited the coast. Let's have a look at that maybe in some of the higher res modelling. Right, so we can see in the high res modelling there, 40 to 45 knot gusts off the coast of Maroochydore, 35 to 40 in some of the sort of hinterland areas just inland of the coastline. Generally speaking, that's about as far as we'll go when it comes to intensity of winds with this thing, right, for the Sunshine Coast and Fraser Coast and hinterland areas, at least until after the cyclones cross the coast. Once the cyclone crosses the coast, what we're interested in, there it is, that's what I wanted to see. What we're interested in as we go into Saturday afternoon and evening, after the cyclone crosses the coast, the flow pattern will turn north to northeasterly through these areas. And we could see a little area just in here around the Sunshine Coast hinterland and Fraser Coast hinterland that starts to produce really deep convection. And then we could start to see really squally winds that are feeding that deep convection in and around the place. And you can see winds gusting up to about 40 to 50 knots on the backside of the cyclone, on that northeasterly to northeasterly flow. Now, these 40 to 50 knots are actually going to feel like 40 to 50 knots because they're coming directly at you off the coastline versus the 40 to 50 knots that could happen today, which is an offshore wind, okay? So this wind that's coming tomorrow, once the cyclones cross the coast, is coming onto the coast. So you're going to feel the effects of that wind properly on the coastline. Now, as we get that little convergence max to develop, we could see our winds really gusting up to about 90, maybe even 100 kilometres an hour through the Sunshine Coast. And you can see some really big squalls developing around that Caloundra Maroochydore area just on the northern side of the cyclone as the cyclone, and after, and this is so important to understand, this is after the cyclones cross the coast. So just when you think everything's just going to settle down and, yep, it's all done and dusted, it comes in and it surprises you. Look at that. You get a bit of a surprise, you get a bit of a shock, and you go, I didn't expect that. So just expect it, because if you don't expect it, that's when you do get shocked. That's when it becomes dangerous. If you expect to see that northeasterly coming in at the backside and you expect it to be quite strong, then there's no surprises. If you don't get it and it's not quite as strong, wonderful. But if you do and you're ready for it, it's all good. That's not a northeasterly that should be creating a lot of damage, but it can do if you're not expecting it and if you're not prepared for it. All right, so that northeasterly is what we're interested in once the cyclone has crossed the coast. And we're also interested in the possibility of very heavy rainfall developing on the hinterland areas as a convergence max occurs here on that northerly to northeasterly flow. Once again, after the cyclone has hit the coast. That will settle down on Sunday quite quickly and push inland and south. Right, so there it is there on Saturday afternoon, night. This is the thing I'm talking about, that convergence max rainfall, and then that northeasterly that'll be feeding into that little fiend of a thing as we go through the nighttime hours. And if you're not expecting, especially because it's going to be happening at nighttime, it'll feel quite scary when the windows start to rattle because of that strong northeasterly. All right, so just be prepared for it. We see that continuing into Sunday morning, and then as Sunday continues, it eases off and pushes off to the west. So the big thing for the sunny coast to understand is the possibility of that really strong wind coming in from the northeast after the cyclone has crossed. At night time on Saturday night, we're going to see the possibility of heavy rainfall on the hinterlands, and then that northeasterly flowing and charging into that cyclone's convergence that's occurring on that northern side, or that convergent band that's occurring on the northern side. Please be ready for it. Don't be scared. It won't last very long. It'll last a few hours, and then it'll push away. Okay? That's where I'll leave you at the moment. That's our best guess at what's going to happen over the next few days. Remember, we are now dealing with a tropical cyclone. That's a slightly different beast to what we were dealing with the last few days. So that means a tighter wind field with that big wind area that I'm looking for around Stradbroke, potentially Moreton Island as well, but Stradbroke Island down to the Gold Coast. That's my big wind field area. And then on top of that, we're looking for the heavy, the big winds on the backside, impacting potentially Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast. Those winds won't be quite as big as the winds on the front side, but they will be significant enough, and they'll be coming directly off the water. Our biggest threat after that is all about rainfall. My next forecast to you will be at 6:30 p.m. and it won't be quite as thorough as this one. We're just looking at any changes that might have ensued between now and 6:30 p.m. Because as I like to say, there ain't nothing good about surprises in a tropical cyclone. Have a good day and stay safe. My apologies, folks. I forgot to add the stuff about Toowoomba and the area inland out towards Texas, Warwick, Stanthorpe. Let's just have a quick look at that area too. Look, there's not too much to talk about here until after the cyclone crosses the coast, right? So our real focus in this area is after the crossing of the cyclone. Up until that point, we're looking at a few gusty showers. What we are interested in is perhaps some of the higher country areas, and what we can see here when we take a look at the wind gusts, we can see some pretty significant wind gusts in these higher country areas. These elevated areas could see winds gusting up to about 100, maybe 110 kilometres an hour at times, especially in open pockets. So obviously not if you're in between trees, but if you're in an open field at the top of those mountains, there is a chance there that we see those winds getting right up into that 100, 105, maybe 110 kilometre an hour gust range, not necessarily sustained. If we take a look at sustained winds, they're way, way less than that. You can see sustained winds are down around 20 knots or so, okay? So don't expect that to be just the norm to see those sort of, that level of wind. But it is important to understand that we are going to see gusty winds in the meantime, and we are going to see a few showers in the meantime, but we're not expecting to see very heavy rainfall until here. So once the cyclone has come onto the coast, what happens here is that the flow pattern will change. So instead of having a southerly flow, and it'll be a gusty southerly flow with gusts up around 100 kilometres an hour, but what happens now is we start to develop an east to northeasterly flow, and that's what starts to drive our more significant rainfall potential through these areas, right? And you can see our primary threat areas are these areas here where we get strong winds meeting weak winds, not necessarily where the weak winds are weak all over them, but it's where strong winds meet weak winds. This is an area of convergence and or confluence, depending on exactly where you are. And this is an area where we force lift from the atmosphere. And this is the region that we would be anticipating that to occur between Ipswich, Boonah, out towards Warwick. Probably just south of Toowoomba at this stage is what we're thinking. And you can see just after landfall, we haven't quite got there yet with the Access C Southeast Queensland because it's just a little too far out for the model to pick up. But we're just starting to see that heavier rainfall developing on Saturday night in these hinterland areas. And we're going to see that general rain area shift west and southwards as we go through into Sunday morning, and then beyond Sunday as we push into Monday, that will all settle down. But there is a period here that we do expect to see very significant rainfall in the district, and it begins Saturday night. Up until then, it's just these gusty, squally showers coming through, and then after that point, we start to see the real stuff. And you can see at this stage, just south of Toowoomba is where we'd be expecting to see our biggest rainfall, and that extends out towards Warwick and areas down towards Stanthorpe. That appears to be our focal point of rainfall. Our winds will max out at that 100-kilometre range, and most of the winds that are at that range will be gusty winds and usually on elevated terrain. And what we'll end up seeing once the cyclone comes inland, we're not going to see all that really significant wind from the northeast. So our most significant wind is probably the southeasterly flow. Once the cyclone moves inland and to the west, we're probably going to see more of an easterly flow that gets fresh to strong at times, but not quite as strong as that southeasterly and then coming down the mountain slope the other side. So we're not going to see that accelerated wind field on the back side of the cyclone that we are on the front side of the cyclone. You can see how strong some of these winds are on the front side. They won't be quite as strong on the backside. But our rainfall will be much stronger and heavier once the cyclone is pushed westwards past you. So once it passes you, that's when this east to northeasterly flow kicks in. That's when our heavy and intense rain kicks in. And this area between Ipswich, Boonah, Warwick, this is a really intensity for flash flood risk area. As I say, that may extend up towards Toowoomba, depending on the exact trajectory of the cyclone. Anyway, I hope that's cleared things up for what you can expect over the next couple of days.